Chapter 1. The operation begins. The van jolted slightly as it hit another pothole, the hum of the engine the only constant sound in the otherwise tense silence. 6 of us were crammed into the unmarked vehicle, dressed in black tactical gear with FBI patches strapped over our chests. I tightened my grip on the edge of the bench seat, trying to ignore the dull ache in my legs from sitting too long. My gaze shifted to the back of the van, where the raid leader was quietly rechecking his notes on a clipboard. This wasn't my first raid, not by a long shot, but something about this one felt off. Maybe it was the way no one had cracked a joke the entire ride, or how the team leader had kept his voice low during the briefing, his words clipped and deliberate. How the team leaders had spoken in silence constantly for 2 days, instead of whispering comments like friends experiencing something similar. How low did it go? "We're hitting Sean Combs's estate tonight," he had announced earlier, the name hanging heavy in the air. The room had gone dead silent. Everyone knew Diddy, musician, mogul, cultural icon, but that was the version you saw on magazine covers and talk shows. Behind the scenes, his name was tied to whispers of extravagant parties that veered into the disturbing. Some said underage individuals had been involved. Others talked about blackmail, coercion, and worse. None of it was ever proven. Until now, apparently. Officially, the raid was about financial fraud and alleged connections to trafficking networks. Unofficially, the higher-ups had made it clear there was more to this operation than the paperwork suggested. "Don't get too curious," one senior agent had warned us, his eyes locking on mine. "You're here to collect evidence, not play detective." Say it with me. That line had stuck with me. It wasn't the kind of thing you said unless you expected questions to be asked. 2 minutes out, the driver called from the front, breaking the silence. I adjusted the strap of my utility vest and glanced around at the team. Most were staring straight ahead, their expressions set in stone. Beside me, Agent Lopez was double-checking the safety on her sidearm, her lips moving as if she were silently rehearsing once we got inside. The rest of us were lost in our own thoughts. For me, it was hard not to think about the man we were about to face. Sean "Diddy" Combs was untouchable. Or at least he had been. His empire spanned decades, from music to fashion to alcohol brands, and his public persona was built on charm and charisma. But the stories had been circulating for years, bubbling just beneath the surface. Whispers of young people being coerced at his parties. Allegations of hidden cameras and compromised guests. Most people dismissed it as tabloid nonsense, but in our line of work, we knew better than to write off rumors entirely. The van slowed to a stop, the tires crunching on gravel. My pulse quickened as I heard the faint hum of the estate's high-tech security system through the walls of the van. The raid leader gave us a quick nod, signaling it was time. The door slid open, and the woman within stepped forward. We filed out of the van, boots hitting the ground in unison. The air was heavy with tension as we moved toward the towering gates of the estate. Even in the dim light, it was clear this wasn't just a mansion. It was a fortress. Tall hedges surrounded the property, and a sleek black gate stood between us and the sprawling driveway that led to Diddy's front door. Beyond that, the silhouette of the estate loomed like a shadow against the night sky. "Breach team, on me," the raid leader barked softly. He gestured toward the gate, where 2 agents were already working on disabling the security system. I took my position near the rear, my eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. When the raid leader returned, it was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. A small part of me wondered if Diddy already knew we were coming. A man with his resources didn't go down without a fight, or without calling in favors from powerful friends. Instead, silence reigned, listening. The gate clicked open with a metallic hiss, and we moved in, our boots muffled against the perfectly manicured gravel. The driveway was lined with luxury cars, each one gleaming even under the faint moonlight. My gaze flicked toward the house itself. Massive glass windows framed the front, giving a glimpse of the opulence inside. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and artwork that probably cost more than my yearly salary. We split into two groups, one heading toward the main entrance and the other circling around to secure the perimeter. I was part of the latter, my heart pounding as we moved toward the side of the estate. Lopez and I exchanged a quick glance as we approached a smaller entrance, the kind of side door staff might use. The lock gave way easily, and we slipped inside, guns raised. The interior was just as extravagant as I'd imagined, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just the eerie silence or the perfectly arranged furniture. It was the sense that this house wasn't meant to be lived in. It was meant to impress, to intimidate. As we swept through the first hallway, I couldn't help but recall the last thing the raid leader had said before we left the briefing room. "This isn't like any raid you've been on before," he had warned. "Stay sharp and don't ask questions you're not ready to hear answers to." At the time, it had felt like unnecessary dramatics. Now, standing in the middle of Diddy's estate, it felt like an understatement. "Clear," Lopez whispered as we finished checking the last room on our side of the ground floor. We regrouped with the others in the grand foyer, where the rest of the team had already detained the staff. A handful of maids and security personnel sat on the marble floor, their faces blank and unreadable. None of them seemed particularly surprised to see us. "Where's Diddy?" the raid leader asked, his voice calm but firm. One of the maids hesitated before nodding toward a hidden panel near the staircase. "Panic room," she muttered. Of course, I thought. A man like Diddy didn't build a house like this without preparing for scenarios exactly like this one. As two agents moved to secure the panic room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping into something much bigger than we realized. The raid had just begun, but already the lines between fact and rumor were starting to blur. Chapter 2. Cracking the facade. The silence inside the estate was almost deafening. The only sounds were the muffled thuds of boots on marble and the occasional crackle of the team's radios. The grandeur of the place felt overwhelming. The high ceilings, gold-scented railings, and polished floors reflected an air of power. Yet something about it all felt staged, like a pristine showroom where nothing was allowed to be out of place. Standing close, I watched her as she passed, and wondered why. We moved with precision, splitting into smaller groups to begin the search. I was assigned to the East Wing with Lopez and another agent, Carter. The hallway stretched out in front of us, lined with expensive-looking paintings and sculptures. As we opened the first door, I braced myself, expecting the usual mess of personal belongings and clutter. Instead, we were met with a room that was almost unnaturally tidy. The bed was perfectly made, the furniture dust-free, and the air smelled faintly of lavender. The bathroom was empty. "Clear," Lopez said, after a quick scan. We moved on to the next room, and then the next, finding much of the same. Each space looked like it belonged in a magazine spread, untouched and impersonal. Yet the deeper we went into the house, the more we started to notice things that didn't add up. Behind a painting in the study, Carter found a safe. It was small and bolted to the wall with a keypad and a thumbprint scanner. "Got something?" he called out. Lopez and I joined him, and she radioed the raid leader. "We've got a locked safe in the East Wing, requesting authorization to breach." She radioed back. "Copy that," came the reply. "Proceed with caution." But never. As Lopez worked on opening the safe, I took a closer look around the room. The bookshelves were lined with expensive leather-bound volumes, but when I ran my finger along one of the spines, it came away clean. Nobody was reading these books. They were props, just like everything else in this house. "Got it," Lopez said, stepping back as the safe door swung open. Inside, we found bundles of cash, neatly wrapped in plastic, along with several USB drives and a stack of unmarked envelopes. "Take it and beg it," Carter said, his voice steady despite the unease that was clearly setting in. As we continued, the discoveries became stranger. One of the larger rooms appeared to be a party space, complete with a fully stocked bar and oversized plush furniture. At first glance, it looked like the kind of place you'd expect from someone like Diddy, flashy and extravagant. But then I noticed the small details: bottles of baby oil stacked on a side table, trays of glasses filled with a pale pink liquid, and small packages of what I could only assume were drugs scattered across the bar. Lopez shook her head, her jaw tightening. "What the hell kind of parties are they throwing here?" "No idea," I muttered, my stomach turning as I took it all in. The staff we encountered didn't make things any easier to process. Each one of them sat quietly where we'd left them, their eyes fixed on the floor. When questioned, their responses were short and rehearsed. "I don't know. I'm not allowed in that part of the house. I just do what I'm told." I nodded, stepped back from the doorframe, and looked at the place where the woman had been. One of the maids, a young woman with dark circles under her eyes, barely flinched when I asked about the room we'd just searched. "I don't clean in there," she said, her voice flat. "I'm not allowed to." "Not allowed by who?" I pressed. She didn't answer, just shook her head and stared at the ground. Meanwhile, in the West Wing, the rest of the team had finally reached the panic room. According to the radio chatter, Diddy was inside, calm as ever. When I arrived to assist, I found him seated on a sleek leather chair, a glass of red wine in hand. He didn't look like a man whose house was being raided by federal agents. If anything, he looked amused. "Gentlemen, welcome," he said, raising his glass slightly. "I hope you're enjoying the tour." The raid leader didn't bite. "John Combs, you are under investigation for multiple allegations, including financial fraud and suspected trafficking activities. We have a warrant to search your property and seize any relevant evidence." Diddy smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Of course, do what you have to do. I've got nothing to hide." His confidence was unnerving, but it wasn't just his words that got under my skin. It was the way he carried himself, as if this whole thing were beneath him. He watched us like a predator sizing up its prey, his smile never faltering. As the agents began cataloging items from the panic room, Diddy glanced in my direction. "You're new to this, aren't you?" he said, his tone casual. "You should know this is all just a show, a little media spectacle to keep people entertained." Didn't respond, keeping my focus on the task at hand, but his words stayed with me as we continued the sweep. It wasn't just what he said, it was the way he said it, like he already knew how this would end. Back in the main hall, the staff were being questioned one by one. Their answers were vague at best, deflective at worst. It was clear they'd been trained to say as little as possible. When one of the senior agents pressed a housekeeper about the items we'd found in the party room, she simply said, "I don't know anything about that, I just clean." The deeper we dug, the more questions we uncovered. Each room seemed to hold a secret, and each person we questioned seemed determined to keep it. By the end of the night, we had barely scratched the surface of what this estate was hiding. As the team regrouped to review the evidence, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something big. The house was too quiet, the staff too compliant, and Diddy too calm. It was as if we were playing right into his hands, and he knew it. Safe and Safe. Chapter 3. The Basement Secrets. The air was already heavy with tension when we stumbled upon the hidden passage. One of the agents had been inspecting a wall panel that seemed slightly misaligned, running his fingers along its edges until he found a hidden latch. With a low creak, the panels swung open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward. It was nothing like the grand, gilded staircases of the main floors. This one was bare concrete, utilitarian, and completely devoid of any charm. We exchanged wary glances, our collective unease deepening. The opulent facade of the estate had masked something far darker below the surface. Basement. The team leader muttered into his radio. "We're going in." As we descended, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. The air grew cooler, almost damp, and the hum of distant machinery replaced the eerie silence from above. Gone were the lavish carpets and gold-accented walls. Down here, the environment was sterile and cold. Industrial lighting cast stark shadows across the plain concrete walls. It was clear this space wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to operate. When we reached the bottom, the basement opened into a labyrinth of rooms and corridors, each one seemingly more unnerving than the last. The first area we entered appeared to be some sort of tech storage room. Rows of servers lined the walls, their lights blinking steadily. Laptops and hard drives were neatly stacked on metal shelves, alongside piles of documents and files. "Got something," an agent called out, holding up a financial ledger. The cover bore no markings, but inside were rows of transactions, names, dates, and suspiciously large sums of money. One section was marked with the phrase, "Special Shipments." My stomach tightened as I flipped through the pages, seeing names and numbers that suggested ties to trafficking operations we'd been briefed on. Another agent booted up one of the laptops. The desktop screen flashed with folders labeled with cryptic titles: Venus, Private Events, and Clients. Every click felt like peeling back a layer of something too horrific to process. "This isn't just fraud," someone whispered, voicing what we were all beginning to suspect. Venus, the gracest of the Venuses, symbols of grief and loss. Farther into the basement, the unease only grew. One room in particular stopped us in our tracks. The walls were covered with strange carvings, scratches that looked more intentional than random. Symbols, some geometric and others chaotic, were etched into the surface, as if someone had spent years gouging them out. The room was nearly empty save for a steel table bolted to the floor and a single camera mounted in a corner. In contrast to the rest of the building, a small table standing in the corner held the single leather chair, its lens pointed down, unblinking. "Or help happened in here," one of the newer agents muttered. No one answered. We weren't supposed to speculate, but the implications were unavoidable. This was a soundproof room, deliberately constructed to contain something, or someone. I leaned closer to inspect the carvings. They seemed almost ritualistic, but the meaning eluded me. My flashlight flickered briefly, and my pulse quickened. "Power surge," another agent said quickly, though the unease in his voice betrayed him. Before we could linger too long, the team leader ordered us to move on. "We'll catalog this later," he said, though his face was pale. It was clear this discovery had rattled even him. The next corridor led us to a small surveillance hub. Screens displayed feeds from various areas of the estate, though some were frozen or showing static. "Play back the archives," the tech specialist said, settling into the chair and pulling up stored footage. The images on the screen cycled through what looked like past events: large gatherings in the mansion's main hall, smaller, more intimate gatherings in one of the private rooms. But then we noticed a pattern. During certain timestamps, the footage cut out completely, replaced by static. This wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately edited the footage, erasing specific moments. "Controlled environments," I murmured, recalling the rumors we'd heard about Diddy's infamous parties. Everything was orchestrated to maintain secrecy. One clip in particular made my skin crawl. The footage was of the basement's soundproof room. The camera feed was live but showed nothing, just an empty space. Then, as we watched, a shadow moved across the screen. It wasn't one of us, and it wasn't the reflection of anything we could see. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared, waiting for more, but the shadow disappeared, leaving the room as empty as before. "We'll need to get this back to the lab," the tech specialist said, his voice trembling slightly. "There's more going on here than just financial fraud." The discoveries were piling up, each one more damning than the last. It felt as though we were peeling back the layers of an intricate web, but with every new piece of evidence, the weight of what we'd uncovered grew heavier. This wasn't just about Diddy. It was about something much larger, much darker. As we prepared to move to the next section of the basement, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It wasn't paranoia, it was an instinct honed from years in the field. There was something about this place that seemed alive, as if the walls themselves were keeping secrets. We entered. "Let's move," the team leader barked, snapping us out of our thoughts. We pressed on, deeper into the maze, not knowing that the worst was still to come. Chapter 4: The Sealed Vault. We weren't finished in the basement. As we moved deeper into the labyrinth of cold, sterile corridors, the weight of what we had already uncovered hung heavy over us. The soundproof room with its carved walls and bolted-down tables still lingered in my mind. Whatever had happened there wasn't just chilling, it was intentional. But we couldn't dwell. The team leader kept us moving, pushing us further into the bowels of the estate. It was one of the agents near the back of the group who called out first. "I've got something here," she said, her voice echoing faintly. We all turned to see her shining her flashlight at a section of wall that didn't quite match the rest. The concrete here was smoother, less aged. Closer inspection revealed faint edges, almost imperceptible, outlining a doorway. The tech specialist stepped forward with his tools, muttering as he ran his scanner along the surface. "There's a biometric lock here," he said, tapping at a hidden panel that lit up under his touch. The lock required more than just a passcode. It needed a fingerprint or retina scan. Clearly, this wasn't just any door. This was meant to stay sealed. I tried to concentrate on what Lilith was saying, completely ignoring her words that were ringing true in my mind, with such clarity It took nearly half an hour of painstaking work, but eventually the lock gave way. The sound of heavy bolts releasing echoed through the corridor, followed by a slow, almost reluctant hiss as the door creaked open. We all raised our flashlights, stepping cautiously into the space beyond. This wasn't like the other rooms we'd seen. It was larger, colder, and even more clinical. Rows of high-tech servers lined the walls, their blinking lights casting an eerie glow. The hum of machinery was louder here, reverberating off the steel-plated walls. The air felt different too, thicker, heavier. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath. I approached one of the servers, running my hand along its smooth surface. "What is this place?" I muttered, though no one answered. The tech specialist had already started working, plugging into the system and trying to access its contents. "Encrypted," he said after a few moments, his voice strained. "This isn't basic encryption either, it's military grade." As he worked, another agent began opening cabinets along the walls. Inside were stacks of unmarked hard drives, more than I'd ever seen in one place. There were also files, physical documents stored in sleek black binders. I pulled one out and opened it, my pulse quickening as I read the contents. These weren't just financial records. They were detailed accounts of transactions involving high-profile individuals. Names I recognized leapt off the pages. Politicians, celebrities, even business tycoons. The sums of money exchanged were astronomical, coded in a way that left no doubt this was part of something deeply organized. There were also references to events, private gatherings held in various locations, complete with attendee lists and timelines. One section of the files was particularly disturbing. It contained contracts, signed agreements that detailed explicit terms of participation in these gatherings. The language was cold, detached, but the implications were clear. Some signatures were scrawled, almost shaky, as if they'd been written under duress. Others were from people too powerful to believe they could ever be caught. Meanwhile, the tech specialist had finally made progress. "I've got access to a few files," he said, his voice tight with tension. He clicked through folders on the screen, each labeled with vague titles: assets, coverage, leverage. He opened the last one, and the room seemed to grow even quieter as we stared at the contents. The record was silent, except for the sound of the writer's heart. The rest held contrition with lowered heads. I was twice vulnerable when I left Titleson. It was a collection of videos and photos. Some were grainy, others crystal clear, but all of them showed the same thing: people in compromising situations. These weren't just party videos. They were blackmail material. Faces we all recognized were there, caught in moments they'd clearly never intended to be seen. Some of the footage was recent, while other files dated back years, even decades. "This is..." someone started to say, but their voice trailed off. It was hard to articulate what we were looking at. "This is leverage," I said, my voice low. "This is how he keeps them in line." One video file in particular caught my attention. It was labeled with nothing but a date, one that matched an infamous party Diddy had hosted years ago. The footage was shaky, as if filmed covertly, but it showed enough. The setting was one of the mansion's lavish rooms, filled with guests. But the focus wasn't on the party. It was on a young woman in the corner, visibly distressed as she was approached by a group of men. The clip ended abruptly, cutting to static. Before we could process what we'd just seen, the tech specialist cursed under his breath. "The system's locking me out," he said. "Whoever set this up, they knew how to cover their tracks." "Download whatever you can," the team leader ordered. "We're not leaving this behind." As we scrambled to gather as much evidence as possible, one of the agents noticed another anomaly in the room. There was a smaller door near the back, almost hidden behind one of the server racks. It was unmarked, with no visible handle or lock. The team leader hesitated for a moment before nodding. "We'll check it out," he said. But before we could make a move, the radio crackled to life. It was one of the agents stationed upstairs, calling for the team leader. "Sir, we've got a situation. Diddy's requesting to speak with you directly." The timing couldn't have been worse. "Handle it," the team leader barked into his radio. "We're busy down here." As the leader turned back to us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to cross a line we couldn't come back from. The deeper we went, the more dangerous this all felt. And as we approached the smaller door, I couldn't help but notice the faint sound of something almost like breathing coming from the other side. Chapter 5, The Room No One Should See. The smaller door at the back of the server room loomed larger than it had any right to. Its unmarked surface and lack of a visible handle only added to the unease rippling through the team. The faint sound we'd heard from the other side, a low, irregular breathing, was now gone. It could have been the pit in my stomach suggested otherwise. But the pit in my stomach suggested otherwise. "Get it open," the team leader ordered, his voice sharp but tinged with hesitation. It took longer than expected. This door wasn't designed like the others. It had a concealed locking mechanism far more complex than even the biometric system we'd bypassed earlier. The tech specialist worked in silence, muttering curses under his breath as he tinkered with the panel. Finally, with a soft click, the door released, swinging open with a hiss of pressurized air. What lay beyond was nothing short of horrifying. The room was small, almost claustrophobic, with walls painted a stark, sterile white. Unlike the rest of the basement, this space felt personal, meticulously curated for a singular purpose. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with tapes and DVDs, each marked with cryptic labels, names, dates, and shorthand codes we didn't recognize. A projector sat on a table in the center, surrounded by discarded reels of film and scattered papers. But it was the items in the far corner that stopped us cold. A row of small, neatly folded clothes lay on a low shelf, alongside children's toys, dolls, stuffed animals, and board games. The juxtaposition of innocence and depravity made my skin crawl. Nearby, a box labeled "Party Supplies" was left half open, revealing more baby oil, empty bottles of champagne, and strange powders in clear plastic bags. "What the hell is this?" someone whispered, their voice barely audible over the pounding of my own heartbeat. The tapes were the first thing we cataloged. I hesitated as I picked one up, reading the label scrawled in black marker, "Event 47, Special Guests." Another was simply marked with a date, one that matched a night I vaguely recalled being splashed across tabloid headlines years ago. "Start running these through," the team leader instructed. "We need to know what we're looking at," continued the team. The projector hummed to life, casting a grainy image onto the wall. It was a party, clearly held in one of the mansion's many lavish rooms. The camera was positioned at an angle, as though hidden, capturing everything without being noticed. Figures moved in and out of the frame, celebrities, politicians, models, all mingling with drinks in hand. At first it looked like any other high-profile gathering, but the longer we watched, the more the cracks began to show. One section of the video focused on a small group seated on plush couches. Among them was Diddy, his presence commanding even in the low-quality footage. He laughed, gesturing animatedly as others around him leaned in, hanging on his every word. But then the camera shifted, zooming in on a figure off to the side. A young girl, no older than 15, stiffly in a chair. Her dress was expensive, but her body language screamed discomfort. The scene shifted abruptly, cutting to static before jumping to another angle. Now the girl was gone, her chair empty, and the guests seemed oblivious. My stomach turned. Whoever had filmed this hadn't just been documenting a party, they'd been recording something much darker. "This lines up with the accusations," I said aloud, my voice trembling, "the ones that never made it to trial." Another video was loaded, this one showing a similar scene. This time, the footage focused on a different room, a smaller, dimly lit space. Two figures sat close together, their conversation hushed but heated. One of them was unmistakably Diddy. The other was a man whose face I recognized immediately, a high-ranking politician. Their words were muffled, but the body language was clear. Deals were being made, and the tension between them hinted at something far from legal. "What are we even looking at?" another agent asked, his voice shaky. "This isn't just blackmail, it's a whole operation." We continued cataloging the room, each new discovery more damning than the last. One of the tapes showed a series of still photos being clicked through rapidly on a computer screen, images of children, their faces pixelated but their vulnerability clear. Another showed what appeared to be a ledger, listing payments alongside names, the sums of money exchanged with staggering, with notes indicating event expenses and guest arrangements. I found it remarkable how generous, much more than we expected. However, we ended up with hundreds of photographs. I was so engrossed in the task that I didn't hear the senior agent approach until he placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "A word," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I folded my arms into a... He pulled me aside, away from the others, and leaned in close. "Listen carefully," he began, his voice low. "You're walking into a world where the rules don't apply. Not to him, not to the people tied to this. You think these files will see the light of day? They won't. stared at him, incredulous. "We have enough evidence here to bring down half of Hollywood, not to mention politicians, and it won't matter." He cut me off. "You think this is the first time someone's tried to take him down? You think the people above us don't already know? They've buried this kind of thing before, and they'll do it again." His words hung heavy in the air. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the exhaustion in his eyes told me he was speaking from experience. "Be careful," he added, his grip on my shoulder tightening. "You don't just risk your career digging into this, you risk everything." I returned to the room feeling like the ground beneath me had shifted. The team leader was reviewing a new batch of files, his expression grim. "We've got enough to fill a courtroom," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. Even he seemed to sense the weight of what we were up against. As we prepared to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that the room itself was alive, its secrets pressing down on us. Each tape, each file, each piece of evidence felt like a thread in a web too large to fully comprehend. And as we packed up our findings, I couldn't help but wonder, what else were we about to uncover? As we prepared to leave the basement, our bags filled with evidence that should have been enough to dismantle empires, there was a lingering weight in the air, a sense of something unresolved. What else was hidden in this place? I wanted to stay, to dig deeper, but protocol and a growing sense of unease forced me to follow orders. After all, the safety of the base was my primary concern. We left the basement, yet the shadows of what we'd seen clung to us, trailing like ghosts as we headed back to the bureau to make sense of everything that we'd found. Chapter 6. The Unveiling. The atmosphere in the command room felt suffocating as we laid out the evidence collected so far. The air buzzed with tension as agents shuffled through files, labeled tapes, and digital drives. Each new piece of evidence added to the growing pile of damning material, painting a picture that was impossible to ignore. Yet, unease lingered. Something about the way our senior officers moved, furtive glances, hushed conversations, suggested that the case was already slipping into murky waters. Back at the bureau, the initial high of discovery had been replaced by mounting frustration. The evidence was strong. Financial records detailing payments to known traffickers, surveillance footage implicating powerful figures in compromising situations, and cryptic contracts signed under suspicious circumstances. It was the kind of material that should have ignited a firestorm of action. Instead, key files began to vanish. At first it was subtle. A few tapes went missing from the inventory list. Then a ledger we'd meticulously cataloged disappeared from its evidence locker. Questions were met with vague responses. "It's being reviewed," or "It's been moved to a higher security facility." But no one could, or would, say exactly where these crucial pieces had gone. Whispers among the agents grew louder, doubts creeping into even the most steadfast among us. For me, the breaking point came when a senior agent abruptly closed a meeting mid-discussion. "This is above your pay grade," he said flatly, brushing aside our concerns about the missing files. His dismissive tone ignited a fury inside me. I knew what this was. Pressure from forces we couldn't see but could definitely feel. The next blow came from outside the bureau. News outlets began running stories framing the raid as an overreach, an invasive stunt orchestrated by jealous rivals or an overzealous task force. Diddy's PR machine kicked into overdrive, portraying him as the victim of a smear campaign. Headlines twisted the narrative, questioning the credibility of the operation and subtly discrediting the FBI's findings. But it wasn't just the media. The man himself was making moves. During an unexpected press conference outside his estate, now swarming with lawyers and camera crews, Diddy exuded calm, brushing off the raid with practiced ease. "This isn't the first time they've come for me," he said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It won't be the last, but the truth always comes out, and I'm confident it will this time too." His words were a masterstroke. They planted seeds of doubt, not just in the public's mind, but within our ranks. Was this truly a watertight case? Could it withstand the legal onslaught that was sure to follow? More importantly, how far would his influence extend? Behind closed doors, rumors swirled. Diddy's connections ran deep. Politicians, law enforcement officials, even media executives. Whispers about backdoor deals and veiled threats began to surface. Some agents speculated that the raid had never been about justice, but about sending a message or appeasing a rival power. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but the more I saw, the more I realized we were up against something far bigger than one man. Still, I couldn't let it go. The evidence we'd found was too significant, the implications too horrifying to ignore. Late nights spent reviewing footage and poring over files only strengthened my resolve. The ledgers detailing trafficking payments weren't just numbers. They represented lives, individuals swept up in something monstrous. Every missing file, every vanishing tape felt like a personal failure, a reminder that the system we served wasn't as incorruptible as we wanted to believe. Later that night, we packed up the rest of our belongings and settled in for the night, intent on sleeping as soon as possible. The turning point came one night when I received an unmarked envelope at my home. Inside was a single photo, a grainy image of me entering the Bureau's evidence room. Attached was a note scrawled in barely legible handwriting. "You're walking a dangerous line." My blood ran cold. The message was clear. Someone wanted me to back off. He lifted his eyes to my face and said, "Niece." But instead of intimidating me, it solidified my determination. Whoever was pulling strings behind the scenes was scared. They wouldn't resort to threats if they weren't worried about what we might uncover. That realization gave me a sliver of hope, though it was quickly tempered by the knowledge that I couldn't trust everyone around me. The final straw came during a closed-door meeting with the lead investigator. I'd pushed for answers about the missing evidence, my frustration boiling over into a confrontation. "We can't just sit back and let this happen," I argued. "We have enough to blow this case wide open. If we move now, we can stay ahead of whatever's happening." The lead investigator's expression was unreadable. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Do you really think this is about justice?" he asked quietly. His tone wasn't accusatory, but it carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much. "This case, it's a game, a dangerous one, and you're not playing it as carefully as you should." I stared at him, anger and disbelief bubbling to the surface. "So what? We just let him walk? Pretend we didn't find what we found?" He sighed, the weight of his position evident in his posture. "I'm saying you need to be smart. You've seen what happens to people who push too hard. Don't let this ruin you." The meeting ended, but his words stayed with me. I wasn't naive enough to think I could take on an entire system alone, but I also couldn't sit back and watch as everything we'd uncovered was buried. The missing files, the media manipulation, the veiled threats. It all pointed to one conclusion. This wasn't just about Diddy. It was about power, and the lengths those who held it would go to protect themselves. As I left the Bureau that night, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement, I made a decision. If the system wouldn't act, I would. The truth was too important to bury, no matter the cost. Chapter 7. The Fallout. The fallout began subtly, like the first faint cracks in a dam before it breaks. It started with a car, a black sedan with tinted windows that appeared outside my apartment one evening. At first, I thought it was nothing, a neighbor's visitor, maybe. But when it lingered for hours and reappeared the next day, parked just a little further down the street, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. The agency was under contract to supply a country physician and an elective surgeon within a month. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself I was imagining things. But then came the phone calls. The number was always blocked, and the other end of the line was always silent, just static, faint and constant, before the call disconnected. It wasn't until the third time it happened that I began to feel the weight of it pressing down on me. This wasn't paranoia. Someone was watching, listening, waiting. Inside the bureau, the atmosphere had shifted too. Colleagues who had been allies days ago now avoided eye contact, their conversations cutting off abruptly when I entered a room. Others were more blatant, questioning my decisions during the raid or dismissing the evidence we'd uncovered as circumstantial. "You're overreaching," one agent told me during a heated exchange. "Not every big fish is part of a conspiracy." But I knew better. The missing files, the media spin, the anonymous threats, it was all connected. Diddy's PR team had gone into overdrive, flooding news outlets with stories framing him as the victim of a baseless vendetta. Talk show hosts parroted the narrative, questioning the FBI's motives and painting us as overzealous enforcers targeting a successful black entrepreneur out of jealousy or spite. Social media was a minefield of divided opinions, but the loudest voices echoed the same refrain. Diddy was innocent, and we were the villains. The shift in public perception stung more than I expected. The raid had been my chance to make a real difference, to bring light to the darkest corners of power and privilege. Now it was being reduced to a punchline in late-night monologues and a nothing burger by pundits eager to dismiss the allegations. But even more frustrating was the realization that many of my colleagues were starting to believe the spin. Their resolve faltered under the weight of public scrutiny, and I felt the isolation deepen. The turning point came one night when I returned home to find my front door ajar. My pulse quickened as I stepped inside, scanning the dimly lit space for anything out of place. At first, nothing seemed amiss. But then I noticed the photo frame on the coffee table, a picture of me and my younger sister during a rare vacation years ago. The glass was cracked, a jagged line splitting our faces. Next to it was a single sheet of paper with the words, "Don't push it," scrawled in uneven handwriting. Scraping the words was the face of my little sister, dead in the face. A picture of me and my younger sister during a rare vacation years ago. The two boys looking up at me with pained expressions on their faces. Next to it was a single word. Modern photographs, in the German language, didn't exist back then. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. My family was being pulled into this, and that was a line I couldn't let them cross. I locked every door and window in the apartment that night, sitting in the dark with my phone in one hand and my service weapon in the other. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards as I paced the room. Sleep was out of the question. The next day, I tried to bring my concerns to a trusted superior, but their reaction left me cold. "It's unfortunate," they said with a shrug, their tone devoid of empathy. "But this is what happens when you dig too deep. Maybe it's time to step back." I stared at them, disbelief and anger warring inside me. They weren't just turning a blind eye, they were complicit. It became clear that I couldn't rely on the Bureau to act. The system was too tangled, too compromised. Key evidence had already vanished, and I had no doubt more would follow. I was running out of options, but one thing was clear. I couldn't let this story be buried. Footnote: the prince who had followed the story. That evening, I sat down at my laptop and stared at the files I'd managed to save. Copies of ledgers, encrypted drives, surveillance footage, and a few damning images that had somehow slipped through the cracks. My cursor hovered over the folder as I wrestled with the enormity of what I was about to do. This wasn't just about exposing Diddy. It was about going against an entire machine designed to protect people like him. I thought about the risks, the potential blowback. If anyone traced the leak back to me, my career would be over, my safety, my family's safety, compromised. But the alternative was worse. Letting this evidence disappear, letting the victims go unheard and unseen, was a betrayal I couldn't live with. "Fine," I said, my voice trembling. I reached out to a journalist I'd followed for years, a relentless investigator known for taking on powerful figures and coming out unscathed. Using an encrypted email account, I sent a carefully worded message, attaching a fraction of the files as proof. "There's more," I wrote, "but I need to know I can trust you." Hours passed with no response. I checked my phone obsessively, every buzz making my heart leap. Finally, a reply came. "We need to meet. Secure location. Your call." The relief was brief, swallowed quickly by a wave of anxiety. There was no turning back now. The decision was made, the wheels set in motion. I packed a bag with essentials, knowing I might not return home for a while. Before leaving, I took one last look at the photo on the coffee table, now taped back together, but still bearing the scar of its earlier message. It held a visual message marking the spot where her hand had slipped away and her fingernails had lingered. As I locked the door and stepped into the night, I felt a strange mix of fear and resolve. The threats, the surveillance, the isolation. It was all designed to break me, to keep me silent. But they had underestimated one thing. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for the truth, for the victims whose voices had been drowned out by power and privilege. And I wasn't about to let them win. Chapter 8. Shadows of Truth. The leak was slow to make waves, but when it did, the ripples turned into something far bigger. The files I'd sent to the journalist were handled with the kind of caution that only comes with knowing you're treading on dangerous ground. At first, there were whispers, carefully worded articles in smaller outlets that hinted at corruption, coercion, and the kind of systemic abuse that thrived in the shadows. Names weren't mentioned, but the details were enough to make anyone paying attention connect the dots. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope. The evidence was out there now, beyond the reach of shredders and blackouts. Investigations were quietly launched, though it was clear they were being handled delicately. Too many powerful people had too much to lose. Still, it was a start, a crack in the wall that Diddy and his kind had built around themselves. But relief was fleeting. The shadow of his influence loomed larger with every passing day. The first sign came during my final days at the FBI. I had handed in my resignation, knowing my position was untenable. The hostility from colleagues, the vanished files, the blatant stonewalling. It was clear I wasn't safe there anymore. I had planned to leave quietly, to slip out without attracting attention. But Diddy had other plans. "Such as it is," I answered pointedly. On my last day, I was called into a meeting room under the pretense of signing exit paperwork. Instead, I found myself face to face with him. He sat at the head of the table, hands folded, that same unnerving smirk on his face. Two lawyers flanked him, their expressions as cold as the room felt. "Impossible to explain," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "I wanted to personally thank you for the entertainment you've provided these past weeks." I said nothing, my jaw tightening as I met his gaze. "You think you've made a difference," he continued, leaning forward slightly. "But you're playing with forces you don't understand. You should have stayed in your lane." There was no malice in his tone, only quiet amusement, which made his words all the more chilling. His confidence was unshaken, even after everything we'd uncovered. It was as though he already knew how this would play out, that no matter how much evidence surfaced, he would come out unscathed. "You can leave now," he added, leaning back. "But remember, the game isn't over. Not for you." I walked out without a word, but his voice stayed with me long after the door closed. Leaving the bureau didn't bring the peace I'd hoped for. I relocated to a small cabin hours away from the nearest city, a place so remote even GPS struggled to find it. It was the kind of quiet I thought would calm my nerves, but instead it amplified them. Every creak of the floorboards, every snap of a twig outside sent my pulse racing. The paranoia that had begun during the raid had grown into something all-consuming. At first I convinced myself it was just the trauma of it all. But then the signs began to pile up. A black car idling on the dirt road near my cabin. An envelope in my mailbox with no return address, containing only a single blank sheet of paper. And then the package. It arrived one morning, left on my porch without a sound. There was no note, no markings, just a small cardboard box sealed with black tape. My hands trembled as I brought it inside, setting it on the kitchen table. For a long time, I just stared at it, too afraid to open it. My mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. When I finally cut the tape and lifted the lid, I found a USB drive resting inside. No explanation, no label, just the drive. I held it in my hand, the weight of it far heavier than its physical form. My thoughts spiraled. What was on it? More evidence? A threat? A trap? Part of me wanted to plug it into my laptop immediately, to know once and for all what I was dealing with. But another part of me, the part that had seen firsthand the lengths people like Diddy would go to, wanted to destroy it, to toss it into the fire and pretend it never existed. The air in the cabin felt stifling, as though the walls themselves were closing in. I placed the drive on the table and paced the room, my thoughts warring with one another. Opening it could mean answers, but it could also mean inviting danger into my life again. Destroying it would protect me, but at what cost? What if it held the key to finally exposing everything? As night fell, the cabin grew darker and quieter, save for the occasional rustle of leaves outside. I sat at the table, staring at the USB, its reflective surface catching the faint light of the overhead bulb. My decision weighed heavily on me, the consequences of either choice stretching out into unknown territory. And then I heard it. A faint sound, almost imperceptible. A soft knock on the door. I reached for the USB, gripping it tightly in my hand as I stood, every muscle in my body tensed. My heart pounded as I approached the door, my other hand reaching for the lock. But before I could open it, the knocking stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But all I was met with was silence. When I finally opened the door, the porch was empty. No footprints in the dirt, no sign anyone had been there, just the oppressive stillness of the forest around me. I closed the door and locked it, the USB still clutched in my hand. Whatever decision I made, I knew one thing for certain. Diddy's shadow wasn't just looming, it was growing. As I sat back down at the table, staring once more at the drive, the weight of it all pressed down on me. I didn't know if I would ever truly be free of what I'd uncovered. The choice before me felt impossible, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. The story ends here, not because it's over, but because the next chapter is yet to be written. And in this game, the rules are anything but fair.